In this video, I'd like to talk a bit about polling. Polling is a tool that is used to understand American voting behavior and at times predict American voting behavior, and certainly is another way that we can determine not just voting behavior, but also public opinion. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the mathematical and scientific aspects of polling, and maybe suggest some questions you can ask when you look at a poll. So the principle behind polling is sampling. And the idea behind sampling is essentially that when you look at a population, whether it be a population of animals, population of human beings, population of Colorado, population of the United States, you can't look at the entire population. I mean, imagine if we were trying to predict or determine how people felt about a particular issue, like who's going to win the World Series this year. If we had to ask every single American, it would be very costly and prohibitively costly, right? So what we do is we try to find a sample of the general population. And so here are some of the basic concepts that we use when we're sampling. First of all, the technique is called stratified sampling. It's the method of using a subset of a larger group to draw conclusions about that group. So if we're trying to draw conclusions about people in Colorado, we want to use a sample of people in Colorado. If we want to draw conclusions about people in the United States, then our sample should be drawn from throughout the United States. The population is the group about which the conclusion is being drawn. So again, we're using a sample, which is the subset of that population, to draw conclusions about the population. So we may phone 1,000 registered voters in the state of Colorado, and that would be our sample. And based on the responses of those 1,000 voters, we then draw conclusions about what the entire population, that is the registered voters in the state of Colorado, think. If the video looks a little bit strange, I had to pause it, and I may have had a technical issue there. But in terms of sampling, first of all, a sample must be random. For example, if you were to try and draw a conclusion about voters in the state of Colorado, and your sampling was all from Colorado Springs, you're going to get a more conservative view of the voters than if you, say, took it from Boulder. And so the idea about randomness is a sample is random if and only if every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. If a sample is not random, it's said to be biased. Now, I want to be careful about this word biased because, of course, we can talk about a something to be biased politically, like this person's pro gun control or this person's pro Democrat or whatever it is. But when we talk about a biased sample, we're simply saying that the sample isn't completely representative of the entire population. So here's some examples of bias. Taking samples from the edge of the pond to determine how much algae are in the entire pond. If you take samples from the edge, you may not, they're more likely to be algae at the edge of the pond than there are, say, in the middle of the pond. Phoning at one specific time of day. Again, there may be people who work during the day, and if you're phoning their homes, I know this is a little bit obsolete and that does pose problems. I'll explain that in a second. But if you phone at one specific time of day, then you're getting people who happen to be home at that particular point in time. Whether you phone in the evening and you're leaving out people who have evening activities, or you phone during the day and you're leaving out people who might work during the day. Phoning in general has posed problems recently, and there's two reasons for that. One is caller ID. I don't know about you, but if somebody calls me and I don't see their name on my phone, I don't pick up, and so I wait to see if somebody leaves a message. If you're a pollster, generally that's problematic. Second, cell phones make things difficult as well, because now people might have more than one number. I have my work number, I have my home number, I have my cell phone number. Some people just have cell phones, some people have more than one cell phone, and of course cell phones are designed to protect privacy as well. Another example of bias might be going door to door. Again, even if you do door-to-door polling, it happens to be people who are home during that particular point in time. Asking shoppers, if you're doing a marketing survey who are at a particular store, they may not be representative of all shoppers. But of course, if you're asking a question about fashion or clothing and you have a store that is targeted toward your demographic, that might be okay. Self-selected responses are always biased because it deals with people who choose to respond. So if you have an internet poll, for example, where you can choose to be part of it or not, click this, or television stations used to have phone-in polls where you could call this number if you want that person, or that number if you want that person. Those are always biased because, again, they're biased toward the people who are willing to respond. Other types of bias, small sample size. If you have too small a sample size, you really can't draw a conclusion about the entire population. We'll look at that in a little bit. And psychological factors, same thing. Psychological factors are basically looking at the wording of the question or the psychology of the person answering the question. And I'll look at that in just a second. Now, confidence level is the range within which we are confident that the results for the sample reflect the entire population. Now, this is important because, again, I asked 10 of my friends if they have seen a particular movie. Seven of them say yes, they have. The chance that that sample reflects the entire population is small. If we conduct a random sample of 1,000 people, we're going to be more confident that those results accurately reflect the population, but we're still not 100% confident, right? With polling, really, we're looking at probability as opposed to absolute certainty. So surveys and polls generally look at a 95% confidence level. That is, any poll that you look at, we're basically saying we are 19/20ths sure that these results are correct. Or, out of 20 of these polls, we know 19 will be correct. And the error is relative to the sample size, regardless of the population. What that means is every poll is going to have a margin of error. The margin of error is determined by the sample size. Now, what's interesting about this is the margin of error for 1,000 respondents is the same if your sample is the United States or Colorado or Denver. And so that's kind of an interesting thing, but it's a mathematical thing that's actually difficult for me to explain, but if you really want, post a question and I'll do my best. So for a 95% confidence level, you'll see the number of interviews that will lead to a margin of error. So if we were going to, again, assuming that the poll was well designed and that the sample is random, if we interview 9,604 people, we'll have a margin of error of plus or minus 1%. If we want to get to a margin of error of plus or minus 4%, we go to about 600, and plus or minus 5%, 384. Usually you can see that people want to get about to the plus or minus 4% because you'd almost have to double your sample size to get to plus or minus 3%, and that is usually quite costly. So usually polling, it's done in many different ways, but usually a sample size of about 600 gets you what you want, plus or minus 4%. Now, by the way, what this means is, let's say you interview 600 people, and I'm trying to think of an election that might be coming up. I'm going to just make this up. Let's say it's California, and Jack Nicholson is running against Charlize Theron for governor. That would be an interesting election. And let's say we do a sample of 600 people, randomly selected from throughout California, and 51% say they're for Jack Nicholson, and 49% say they're for Charlize Theron. What that would indicate is that it's a statistical tie because it's within that 4%. So, but on the other hand, if Charlize Theron had 63%, and Jack Nicholson had 37%. That's well outside the plus or minus 4, and so we would say that Charlize Theron is winning the election, or at least if the election were held today, we could say we're 95% confidence that Charlize Theron would win. Probably more because of the great margin. All right, psychological factors. It's not just important to look at the sample size and the population and how the sample is chosen, but also how the questions are asked. Because even in anonymous surveys, for example, respondents will tend toward answers that will please the questioner. So if I was going to do a poll on, say, gun control and say, hey, I'm from the National Rifle Association and I want to know what you think of gun control, people are automatically going to say, well, or more likely, I should say, more likely to say I'm opposed to it. But if I say I'm for the National Society for Gun Control, I'm making it up because I don't believe there's an organization that's called that, you might get different answers. Not because people are changing their mind, but because they're going to want to tend to please the questioner. So it's best that people don't know what side the questioner is on. A good example of the psychological factors is the placebo effect. You give somebody a pill and you say, hey, this pill is going to cure your headache. They take the pill, their headache is cured, and you think, great, this pill cures headaches, but it turns out they were given a Tic Tac. Okay, that's why usually what they do is they either give someone a placebo or the actual medication. They don't tell people which is which to control for that. Questions should not be phrased in a way that suggests an answer. So if I were going to say, are you in favor of the tax cut that is going to increase the budget deficit and unfairly help the rich, that would be an example of a poorly phrased question. Some questions are not likely to elicit an honest response. Do you intend to vote? If you ask people if they intend to vote, of course they intend to vote. But you know what happens? It's cold outside, you wake up late, you're running late for work, you don't want to get in line, and of course this is people actually physically going to vote. So they may in their minds intend to vote, but in fact they end up not voting. Sex surveys generally are not worth the paper they're printed on because people will make things up. So you have to ask questions that are designed objectively and to elicit an honest response. A way to address psychological factors is to have what are called double-blind conditions. That is conditions under which neither the surveyor nor the respondent knows what the answer is they're looking for. So it's not enough to call, say, on behalf of the AARP, the American Association for Retired People, and say, are you in favor of defunding Social Security? Because even then, you could give clues with the tone of your voice, totally unintentional, that indicate you're looking for a certain answer. So it's best to just give someone the question, not let them know who they're asking it for, and go from there. So when you're looking at a poll, ask yourself these questions. One, what is the size of the sample? And related to that, what is the margin of error for this poll? Second, how was the sample determined? Is the sample in fact random? Third, what were the questions asked? Usually a good poll will say, here are the way the question was phrased, and were the questions asked in a way to elicit an honest response? And if you look at all of these and the poll checks out, it's a good poll. And that means that there's a high probability the results are correct if the results are outside the margin of error. All right? I hope this is helpful in terms of identifying how to analyze a poll, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say on the subject. Bye.